Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin, my 2D RPG about a marine biologist trying to save the ocean and its inhabitants. It is Monday morning just after 7 a.m. Started things off right with a sunrise workout around 5:45, showered, brewed some coffee, and now I'm at my desk ready to get started on a new feature for Dauphin that I'm really excited about. If you've been following along with this devlog series, you'll know that I most recently finished up a prototype of the player's research log, a part of the Field Notes UI that allows the player to track how many of each species they've saved from corruption and track progress towards rewards associated with certain milestones. Since that last video, I've done just a bit of bug fixing and also added some nice to haves like masking the images of organisms you've not yet discovered and improving the overall behavior of the filter. You may also remember this image that I shared in the days following that video. This artwork, which is still very rough around the edges, is meant to represent the concept of the new functionality that I'm starting on today, which is diving. Before today, we've only seen the player running around above sea level exploring islands and caves. All along, it's been my plan for the player to also be able to explore the depths of the ocean and interact with all the organisms it's home to. In fact, my friend on who the game is based is a marine biologist who spends many of his days in the field diving to collect specimens, so it's just a great fit for the game and something I'm so excited to build. Looking at my Trello board here, you can see what I have in mind so far, and please keep in mind that this will be a feature that evolves with your feedback and as I make progress and playtest as I go. Right away, I know I need to both recreate my underwater concept scene within the engine and provide a way for the player to transition to it. Once the player is underwater, they need to transition to a swimming state, and I'll need to start building the systems to track the player's depth and oxygen retention. My general idea here is for diving to be a skill that the player can level up, so they will ideally start out just with snorkeling gear and maybe free diving in the shallows, and as they gain more experience have the opportunity to unlock diving gear to take them deeper into the ocean and keep them underwater longer. So that's the idea, and before I get too excited, I really just need to build the foundation of this system to get the player below the surface. I have about an hour left before work. Let's get started. Alright y'all, back with a quick update here at 5 p.m. on Monday. The good news is I made it through the workday in one piece, and the bad news is I didn't actually make a ton of progress this morning on the grand kickoff of the diving feature. As you can see, we are here in the Godot engine, and I've actually started making some progress laying out the underwater scene. My initial plan was to kind of create a static implementation here so that I could plop the player down and start messing with their animations and movement. And that was going well, as you can see here, but as I've started laying out these game objects, I've realized that it's going to be really important to architect this scene with procedural generation in mind, meaning that when a player disembarks at any particular dive spot, I can programmatically decide how wide I want the dive site to be, or more importantly, how deep I want it to be. What this ultimately means is that I'm going to have a lot less stuff in this scene over here in the hierarchy to begin with, and a whole lot more stuff here in the script which is currently empty. So I think I'm probably going to end up scrapping most of what I did this morning and start trying to design a procedural way to build out this underwater scene. Hey everyone, it's Wednesday morning now, just after 7, and I'm about to sit down and kick off another development session for the underwater scene. But before I do, I wanted to give you a brief overview of how I'm proposing to architect that scene for procedural generation. If we take a look at my underwater concept art here in A-Sprite, you'll notice in the bottom left that I'm using quite a few layers, and these layers are what allow me to impart a sense of depth into this image. And when I say depth, I don't mean kind of this vertical depth here, but rather the depth from the camera's perspective. So the difference between things in the foreground, like these two pieces of seagrass, and these kind of terrain structures here far in the background. Now, so far in Dauphin's development, we've only seen an overhead perspective, allowing for the use of Y-sort nodes in the engine to manage placing objects in front of other objects. That's going to change in this underwater scene. Instead of having an overhead camera, we're going to have more of a side-on perspective to allow for the introduction of a gameplay mechanic around this vertical depth here. And as a result, I'm no longer going to be able to rely on Y-sort nodes to place objects in front of one another. Instead, I'm going to have kind of a layered system as you see here and manually manage the Z indices of all the objects I want to place in the world. So what does all this look like in the engine? Well, it doesn't look like much yet because I've not made quite as much progress as I would have liked to, but you can see over here in the hierarchy on the left that we have a parent underwater object for this scene and then a collection of node 2Ds as children, and each of these node 2Ds represents one of these layers. So we've got a terrain and water layer in the far background, near background and foreground, and then the ocean floor, surface, and the focus layer, which is where we're going to be putting the player and the flora and fauna that the player can interact with. From a procedural generation standpoint, the concept is actually pretty straightforward. We have our parent underwater procedural class here that has a reference to all of those layers as its children. When we choose to build this procedural scene, we can just loop through those layers and tell the layers to build themselves. It's important that each of these layers knows how to build itself because each of the layers will contain fundamentally different game objects. As you can see here, the foreground layers contain some sand and some flora and fauna, and the background layers typically have more terrain-focused objects, at least in this concept art. These layers will know how to build themselves using an instance of dive spot data, which is meant to represent all the information associated with a dive spot at which the player can initiate a dive. So right now I have things like the biome, which could influence the color of the water, of course, the flora and fauna, and maybe even the terrain. The depth, which is the vertical depth of the dive site, and the radius, which is how far left or right from the camera's perspective the player will be able to explore. This will definitely expand in the future and ultimately contain information about maybe cave entrances that you can explore and certainly information about the animals you'll be able to encounter at the dive site. So that's the plan. I've done far more talking than working this morning, so I'm going to go heads down now on this procedural generation code and hopefully come back with something exciting to show you. Hey everyone, back on Saturday morning here with a quick update after a few particularly productive coding sessions over the past few days. And although it's not really much to look at yet, I'm pleased to say that I've made some very good progress on the procedural layout of my underwater scene. So here we are standing on the beach, and as you can see, there's a brand new item for us to interact with sitting here in the sand. And what this is meant to represent is a dive flag, the flag that the player would leave above them in the water for safety reasons as they dive underneath to explore. And this is just kind of a placeholder piece of artwork and item, but for right now, using this dive flag is what's going to temporarily transport us into this underwater scene. So with this item equipped here in my item bar, I can click, and sure enough, we are transported to a brand new scene that is really just a giant blue rectangle. But you'll note in this particular case, the rectangle is quite deep and not very long from side to side, and this is where my procedural generation stuff comes into play. Down in the left corner of the engine here in the file system, you can see that right next to my definition of the dive spot data resource, I actually have an instance of this resource that I've called test dive spot. And up here in the inspector, you can see some of the fields that we looked at previously that define what a dive spot is. So for right now, I have the biome set as temperate because that's all that I've implemented just for that background blue color. For the depth, we just saw the medium depth. So I'll go ahead and change that to shallow. And the radius was small, meaning the space was not very wide, so I'll go ahead and increase that to large. From here, I can rerun the game. We'll pick up our dive flag and click to be transported to the scene, and you'll notice that now this scene is very shallow. So up here would be ultimately the waves breaking overhead where you'd surface, and down here just below the player would be the sandy bottom, which of course I'll build out in the future. And you'll also notice that this generated scene is much wider than it was before, meaning that the player has a lot more room for lateral exploration in these types of dive spots. So obviously this doesn't look like much yet, but at this point I have successfully established a pattern for building out the layers that will ultimately comprise this underwater scene based on information here in the dive spot data. So I've done that for one of these layers. I've got about 6 more. So in the meantime, I'm going to do just a couple more layers that help provide the basic appearance of the underwater scene, like the surface and maybe the ocean floor. At that point, I'm going to move on to programming the player's controller and the new diving state. Alright, we're going on 5 p.m. this Saturday evening. Today has definitely been a grind, but I'm happy to report that I've made some very cool progress on the dive system. Definitely met the goal I set out for myself today and have something pretty cool to show you to wrap up this week's devlog. So here we are back on the beach with the dive flag in hand, and when we click to transition to the underwater scene and start moving, you'll notice that I've started working on a swimming animation, just kind of kicking his legs behind him. And of course we'll have fins to accompany this in the future so that it looks a little bit more realistic when he's swimming underwater. You can see, of course, I have quite a bit of work to do here. We can swim up and left to right, and I need to work on kind of stopping those animations and having some underwater idling. But this is the very beginning of underwater movement in this scene. On top of just the animation, you can also see that I worked on the ocean floor layer here, so we're now able to draw this repeating kind of sandy ocean bottom for temperate zones here in the procedural ocean. I know everything we worked on in this week's devlog still looks really bad, but if you can look past that, what's important is that we made an underwater scene that can be procedurally generated. We have a way to transition to that scene, and we have a dive state that the player can enter when he's in the water. These things all still need a ton of work, but in their current state, it provides the foundation for what I hope to be a really cool new gameplay mechanic for Dauphin. I hope y'all enjoyed starting out this brand new feature with me this week, and as always, I want to give a huge shout out to my Garami supporters on Patreon: Cody Odin, Finnick Fu Games, Mega Ombre, Vlad Sunny, James Kennedy, Jess Sargo, Deliuz, and Dinozoid, and of course all the other folks who support my work on Dauphin and this channel through Patreon. Keep your eyes peeled for, of course, more devlogs, but also a setup video soon for my brand new planted aquarium on my desk that I teased in this video. Until then, stay safe and see you soon.